So lovely to see you again, Louise. How have you been this week?
Yeah, I've been okay, been quite busy, Mary. So yes, things have been strange still, because obviously still in this period of lockdown, and but obviously quite busy with my website and things like that. How about you?
Yes, busy. I mean, it's interesting how the days um, feel slower. Time seems to have slowed down slightly, which is very nice. And I'm managing to get what I need to get done in a day. So yeah, generally pretty good, really, and just managing to stay well so far. And obviously, you can't avoid the news and what's going on and so forth,
No.
which is upsetting, of course. And there is quite interesting how our talk this week is on grieving. And it's interesting that also at this point we've hit over the whatever threshold of the deaths that were predicted initially.
Yeah.
So it's a concern, and I think we all feel collective grief as we're all human beings and we're all made of flesh and blood and hearts and souls and minds. We all feel this on a deeper level. So it's interesting that our talk this week is on grieving, and this was already sort of pre-planned from weeks ago, wasn't it?
Definitely, it was. And I think, in terms of sort of feeling how I'm feeling, it does change on a daily basis. So I think, like most people, I've gone through a myriad of emotions, to from feeling numb to feeling quite optimistic, then to feeling maybe a little bit angry, and just noticing, like we talked about in our first week, noticing the sort of role, the waves of emotions and feelings that are coming through at this time. But I think for the past couple of days I've known that we were going to be reconnecting, and I absolutely love our conversations.
Likewise.
But I was also thinking about this idea of grief, and like you say, I think whilst I've been busy, I've also felt slower, and really thinking about, the lives lost through this pandemic.
Yes.
The livelihoods lost as well. In terms of, people unable to work or have lost their jobs, or, whatever's going to happen, with this, beyond this, whatever that looks like, the changes, the huge changes that are happening, will happen, have happened. And so this idea of grief, the subject that we had as a theme, has become very present and personalized in my world as the last few days have gone by. And I don't know whether you feel similar.
Absolutely. I think, it's difficult not to feel obviously what's going on and how upsetting it is, and that for many people it's flipped their complete idea of where they thought their life might be going in the future. It's very difficult for lots of people who perhaps are here in this country and their family aren't, and they can't get to see their loved ones other than through a screen. I think there are so many different levels to this, and on a personal level, I think for me, I've been sort of thinking back further again through my past or childhood, and also things that you've lost, friendships perhaps that you had in the past that have been lost, and you wonder what's happened to those people and if they're okay and how things change and how things morph. But I think it's the rule of life, isn't it, that all things do change. I think we're just not used to, perhaps for us in our generation anyway, are not used to experiencing it all on this level. Whereas if I speak to my father, who was born just at the beginning of the Second World War, he's pretty unfazed by this entire pandemic. To him, it's sort of something you just have to be careful of and avoid. But you know, from being a child where he had bombs literally dropping over his head and having to run into a shelter that they built in the garden, you know, but it's all relative to each person and each passing time.
Yeah.
But grief is an interesting area to discuss, because I think it's something which is certainly in West now, and in England in particular, it's definitely not something which is expressed very well.
No.
And we don't know how to express it or what to do with it. If you look at some other cultures, especially in Spain or Italy, and further afield, the grieving process, generally, not just for a loved one who's passed, but grief in general, is much more expressive and embodied, whereas we tend to sort of hold it and try and rationalize it away, I think, with our heads sometimes, or we just hold it in.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. And I was trying to, you know, like we were talking just before we started recording, Mary, about the complexity and the many layers of grief. And I was trying to think about, again, it's back to frameworks, isn't it? So I was trying to think about, you know, the current situation that we find ourselves in, and how I would look at that through my own passion, which is Goethean inquiry and this idea of heart sense. And I was saying to you that, you know, we've gone through the first week of noticing, which was noticing because we had chance to slow down because of the lockdown. You know, how maybe nature was talking to us more. Our lives, we just had this shock, this kind of interruption of our normal. And so we could, I could personally slow down and notice and see things that I might not ordinarily see. And then last week we covered opening towards, well, what that might mean. And in the opening, the interruption of the normal, waiting in that space, because it's not a space that we're used to being in very much in our contemporary society. And I kind of use the analogy that I felt like I was maybe walking along these stepstones. So I'd moved from noticing to another stepstone of opening. And now I feel like I'm on another stepstone in week 3, where I've reached a kind of abyss. So I'm kind of looking back at where I've come from since all of this began and our dialogues began. And I'm now looking over like this cliff edge into a kind of dark abyss. And if I'm thinking about grief in that way, that's how grief is represented to me. Because I'm not only looking back at the past and thinking, what's led us here? You know, because in the noticing and the opening, I'm realizing how fast I live my life. You know, even though I've got a Goethean lens and I look through heart sense at things, there is still a deeply dominant overlying narrative that doesn't look at the world that way. And it's a reminder, I have to keep reminding myself to use these different frameworks to help me to sort of expand my ways of thinking. But at the same time, in looking back, I'm thinking, well, those ways of seeing and thinking we might have had when we were children, when we were so enchanted with the world. The world was talking to us, rocks were talking to us, we were running around, our imagination was running riot. And at a certain point in our education, that gets slowly taken away. And so I'm standing here on the edge of this abyss, looking into this abyss, this darkness, and grieving really for what was lost in my own life at a certain point in my childhood, where I was told by a teacher, we don't think that way. You know, that's not a correct way to think as you move into adulthood. And then a kind of anorexic, we talked about this anorexic narrow view of life last week, didn't we, that then takes its grip of you. And all those sensuous, imaginal, experiential, world talking to you moments, you're turned away, you turn away from it, and they're no longer available to you. And I think I said to you, didn't I, as well, that I felt a deep sadness for the loss of that, grief for the loss of that. And in terms of then how I could engage, I could only engage with the world in a certain way that was anorexic, was narrow itself. How did I contribute to any kind of destruction of the world whilst living in that view? You know, and I'm grieving for what I've lost. I'm grieving for any detrimental impact that I might have had on the world as a result of seeing that way. So that's a deep sadness and a deep grief for me right now, as well as overlaid by all the grief that is going on around us of lives lost, livelihoods lost, grieving for what has happened to our planet and to the ecological destruction and devastation. It's hard to take. It's visceral. It feels visceral. And so I feel like this week I'm kind of really captured in the arms of grief in a very kind of deep way, in so many ways, across so many different layers. And I suppose using a Goethean lens, using a heart sense lens, I'm trying to sit in the discomfort of that, because I know that somewhere in that is the seeds of something else. But it's not easy.
No, and it's really beautiful, actually, what you said there, Louise. I think when we were talking earlier in the week about this sense of loss and grief and this sort of gaping hole, it's when you're following on from the opening. I think sometimes when people are on a particular way of noticing things differently, or a particular path, or you get excited because you found a different way of thinking, and it's a recovery of something that we've lost and that's been taken away from us since childhood, especially in our learning institutions, especially in education, and it's a way of sort of reclaiming that. But it doesn't just come back with joy. There's sadness and sorrow attached to it, because it's something which has been lost. And at the same time, and I remember Iain McGilchrist saying that the left hemisphere is very confident and very optimistic, and the right hemisphere not so much. So I think it's interesting that when you start to broaden your perceptions, or broaden your heart, opening of the heart, and noticing more, that the element of grief that arises is because you are shifting and you are changing. It's not something you can just rationalize away with your head. And I think it makes us remember. And I just wanted to share this poem, or part of a poem, by Khalil Gibran, who was a Persian poet. And I think it's quite interesting in this time that so many people have, looked towards nature, or found solace in poetry or works of art, much more so perhaps than they might usually. So this is a part of a very long poem called The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, and he talks about joy and sorrow. So the whole book, for those who aren't familiar with it, is that he's going through all sorts of different processes and universals, if you like, that we all experience in life. So life and death, joy and sorrow, marriage, love, what all these big things mean. But he says about joy and sorrow, the character in the poem, and they say, your joy is your sorrow unmasked, and the self-same well from which your laughter arises was oftentimes filled with your tears. And how else can it be? The deeper the sorrow carves into your being, the more you can hold. When you are joyous, look deep into your heart, and you shall find it is only that which has given you sorrow that is giving you joy. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart, and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say, joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Verily you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. Only when you are empty are you at a standstill and balanced. And I thought that was quite interesting because he talks about being empty and being balanced.
Yeah.
And I'm not a great fan of everything being completely balanced. And I think it's usual that you have to occupy fully grief and sadness, and then you can fully occupy joy or happiness. But if you never really go into either of them fully, you're just sort of stuck in the middle somewhere, a bit tepid, really. And I think that's always something to remember, that grief and sorrow carve very, very deeply into your being and into the heart. But if it's creating a space in there, then that space can be filled again with as much joy, which is the flip side to sorrow and grief. So I think that was quite comforting.
That is beautiful.
Profound, really. That aspect in that particular poem. But it's really beautiful. The whole book really has to be read in sequence, but I particularly like that one. I thought it was quite relevant.
It is beautiful.
What we were discussing.
And I think, last week we were talking about this sort of tension, weren't we, between, you were talking about the bow last week and this kind of middle space, the tension between, the opposites. And I suppose I was talking about that in a way of, sort of bringing the head and the heart together. Dr. Iain McGilchrist would talk about that in his language in terms of the left and the right hemisphere of the brain, sort of coming together. And I've got this quote from Goethe, who is talking about eternity and time, and they are themselves, two parts of the same whole. So, and he says, death is a commingling of eternity with time. In the death of a good man, eternity is seen looking through time. I think that is so beautiful that, again, it's not either or, it's the both and, which we've talked about. But also in that there is the joy, there is the sorrow, there is all of these things in the opening, in the noticing and the opening, that kind of lead to a space that, yes, we're talking about grief, but grief can hold such a lot, and equally at the same time push through into somewhere else when the time is right, when there is readiness.
Yes, I mean, it's very similar in some ways to that great depth you feel when you fall deeply in love. In some sense, there is the strength is there in the two, although they're bringing slightly different sensations and feelings and so forth. But I think this whole thing that we think of the opposites, don't we, and that somewhere in the middle they meet, and that there's this nice sort of fluffy place in the middle where we're all in balance and there's a nice equilibrium here, and we're neither going to be like that too much and we're neither going to be like that too much. So we're just going to live this nice, happy, safe life, somewhere in the middle, tepid, I call it.
Yeah.
And it's the centre, but in the centre it can be a bit boring. Sometimes you don't really experience life fully sometimes. So it's not to say you're going off and being completely bonkers all the time, or you're reacting to every tiny little thing, because that's not it either. But in what I'm talking about, what we're talking about, these universals, like these big archetypal emotions, really, that everybody feels, of grief, of sorrow, loss, love, a sort of recovery of something. These are archetypal emotions that we'll all feel at some point in life, but they're there to be felt.
Yes.
And not to be pulled away from or controlled too much.
Exactly.
I think.
Yeah. And had I not, again, I talk about, me standing on the edge of this abyss, and I just want to also, make clear that, yes, I'm feeling grief at the moment, but if I if I hadn't have had that experience of having that enchantment maybe taken away from me as a child, and then having lived the life that I have, then I wouldn't be appreciating so much right now my own research, Goethean inquiry, having these conversations with you, noticing an opening in sort of as many parts of my life as I can, because we were talking last week as well, weren't we, about we need all the parts that have got us to here.
Yes.
They are all as important as every other experience that we've had. And so it's not that we're sort of vilifying one and saying this one's better. It's just acknowledging that these are the feelings that we're having, and being with those feelings doesn't mean that one is worse than another or another. It's just that they make up the wholeness of who we are in this present moment right now, which helps us to make more discerned choices, between imaginal, intuitive thinking, supported by the rational intellect. In that space, the two can live very happily together. Any two can live very happily together. And in that space, like Mary, you say, then it's not tepid. It's actually alive. It's creative. It's dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has with it as well, it has character.
Yes.
As well, doesn't it? Because I think that's very interesting point that James Hillman used to talk about quite a lot in his work, that and a recent lecture or talk I listened to between David Feidler and John Sellers, who's a Stoic philosopher. And it's this thing about virtue, doing the right thing, or just living, like how we live, the art of living, it is about developing character. And you can't develop character if you are always trying to live by a set of rules and you're not really sure why you're doing it, or you're not allowing yourself to be embodied in what you're doing or experiencing things fully. And character is very important, because character forms part of that whole experience of how you then experience these emotions, such as grief and loss and sorrow and so forth. And it's what being human is about. And I think as well, we became, especially I think in the last sort of 20 years, there's been a lot of this sort of flawless character building in the media, and in especially coming from the film industry, and the ideal of what it means to have a family, and what it means to live a positive, optimistic life. And there's this sort of whitewashing of character out of that. You can't have someone who's got a sort of strange little character flaw anymore, but actually that's how we all learn. And thank goodness for the odd relatives who might be really grumpy, or tell the child off at the wrong time, which certain people would say is not the right thing to do, but you need those characters in life to help build our resilience to things as well. It builds resilience, I think, and it gives resilience to grief and sorrow, as well as being able to accept joy. And if neither of those are happening in any extreme, that we're also okay sitting with that as well.
Yes.
But there's one image I just wanted to show when you were speaking there about the split from the head from the heart. So this is an image that I wanted to share, and it's a painting that I've always loved, and it's by an artist called Cloud, who was not Renaissance for me for once, but he was painting a little bit after that, at the beginning of the Romantic era. But it's called, it had two titles actually. It's now called The Enchanted Castle. It's in the National Gallery, and it's this sort of beautiful poetic landscape. And Cloud's idea was that he was trying to paint nature more beautiful than nature was really herself. It's this wonderful, beautiful landscape. But the original title was actually Psyche outside the palace of Cupid, or Eros. So Eros, or Cupid, is here inside the castle, fortified in this landscape, and here's Psyche sitting alone. And I love this painting for lots of reasons, but if I'm talking about its symbolic meaning, really, which obviously has to be found through the beauty of the image itself, I don't want to just skip over that, but it is that sense of psyche split from head, from heart, soul split from heart. And that's really what was happening at this time in history as well. It was just at the beginning of the Enlightenment period. Very interesting that this image comes out of that period. And it's just a beautiful symbolic image showing Psyche and Eros separated, as we have separated head from heart. And there's a Mary Angelou quote, who's a scholar, who I know you know, but she's a wonderful scholar, and she said about Psyche in this quote that I felt really resonated. And she said, "We are involved in Psyche's tasks, Psyche's initiatory tale, hence ours, for we are all souls, is about passionate love, bitter separation, and eventual rejoining with the beloved." And I think that's a beautiful quote that sits quite nicely with that image, which encapsulates this split, the grieving, really, the grief and the depth of not only how we've split from our own heart and our own head or our own souls, but how, as Psyche soul was out there in the world. It's not just something that we possessed as our own soul was in the world. So I think that's a very beautiful image to
it is beautiful,
encapsulate.
Mary. Very much so. And as you were talking, actually, this idea of the split and then becoming so focused on one particular mode of perception. And if we use Iain McGilchrist terms, a sort of left brain hemisphere take on the world. I just wanted to sort of read something from the Master and his Emissary, because really it does kind of fit so nicely into what we're talking about today. And he says, well, what would happen in a world where the left brain hemisphere took kind of control, and its take was the only take in the world, and it doesn't bring in the imaginal, intuitive qualities of the right brain hemisphere in McGilchrist terms. In my own terms, the way that I look at that is it doesn't bring in the kind of love, wisdom, intuitive, imaginary, sensory experience of the heart wisdom. But it's the same thing. So what if we were just focused on sort of one particular way of seeing that is so anorexic? And he says, what would that society look like? So I'm thinking now about Psyche and Eros being split, and they've been split for such a long time. What would one particular focus look like? And he says, this is from his book, it's on page 432. In such a society, people of all kinds would attach an unusual importance to being in control. Accidents and illnesses, since they are beyond our control, would therefore be particularly threatening, and would, where possible, be blamed on others, since they would look like a threat to one's capacity to control one's life. The left hemisphere, as will be remembered, is in any case not quick to take responsibility, and sees itself as a passive victim of whatever it is not conscious of having willed. And then he goes on to say, reasonableness would be replaced by rationality, and perhaps the very concept of reasonableness might become unintelligible. There would be a complete failure of common sense, and I just added in there heart sense, this kind of discernible wisdom, heart wisdom. There'll be a failure of that, since it is intuitive and relies on both hemispheres working together. anger and aggressive behavior would become more evident in our social interactions. Since all emotional states, these are of the most highly characteristic of the left hemisphere and would no longer be counterbalanced by the empathic skills of the right hemisphere. And again, I would add there the heart. Although, interestingly, you know, there is some research been done by HeartMath Institute that says that the heart and the right hemisphere are actually intricately linked physiologically, which is quite interesting. But that's another talk altogether. But I just thought, gosh, how interesting is that in terms of, I recognise that world. That's the world that I have lived in, you know, for a very, very long time, until I started to bring my right hemisphere back in, my heart, you know, starting to use Goethean inquiry. But all of that, when you start to put those parts of yourself back together, that there is a sense of loss, a sense of grieving for what would have been, what could have been, but also in that is the seed of what might be, what could be.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's many things there that I thought of, but that particular paragraph that you read out gave me shivers. I mean, I've read it a few times myself, but every time you hear it, and you, especially when you hear somebody else saying it as well, you just realize this is the world we're living in. But until it's pointed out to you, you carry on in this sort of half sleep, or with the veil across your eyes, you know, that you don't see the other side, or you don't see that there's anything wrong, or what's wrong. You know, nobody's said it's wrong, and we've grown up in it, and who's to say the structures are wrong, and education's gone off at a peculiar tangent, and you know, they're getting rid of the humanities left, right and centre, and anyway, we have bureaucracy running a riot and very straight, want to control everything. And when we can't, we don't like it. So there's a lot there which hits actually right to my heart when I hear those words. I'm not thinking it, they're hitting here. You know, it's a visceral response that I have to those words, for sure, because they're true, aren't they? It's what the world that we live in.
It's what we, and I think it hits us viscerally because it's what we know. You know, that's it's certainly my experience. It has been my experience of it. So you know,
we've lived it. We've lived it. I mean, we've lived in that whole experience.
Lived in.
That's what we've been told to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I think this idea of grief is extremely important, you know, in the looking back, in the looking forward. You know, in that grief, I want to honour everything I've learnt, because it's important. And to honour what came before, to honour my experience, to honour my heart and my head, to honour the grief, and also start to consider where dropping into that grief might take me beyond that as well.
Yes, and I think it is that dropping into it, Louise, isn't it, that's so essential. I mean, we can resist it, but dropping into it allows you to go into depths of things that you wouldn't necessarily have seen from any other place. That depth is necessary. Exactly. Because from that place you'll see even more. And it's sort of taking you right back into the soil of the earth. You know, it's going really deep, you know, right down into our bones, into the marrow, this depth which needs to be recognized. And from there, I think you can see you see differently, and you're not the same when you come out. Our experiences do change us.
Exactly. It definitely needs to be felt, because it's only in the feeling and the dropping into it that really anything creative, any possibilities can make themselves authentically known.
Absolutely. So there's just another quote I wanted to show from Heraclitus, which gives us some sense of an overview, really, of the rules of life and the cosmos. So he says, by cosmic rule, as day yields night, so winter, summer, war, peace, plenty, famine, all things change. And I think that's something to be reminded of, whether you are going through a real difficult time of grieving, especially, that it will also constantly change. Not that you're racing to get to the end of it either, but things will always change. Always. They never stay the same all the time. And that's also a sense of hope, perhaps, for our world as well, that it will keep changing, and it always will, but let's hope it changes in a way that's going to restore the soul of the world as well, to some extent, because while we're grieving, I think the earth is certainly grieving as well. Absolutely. For her loss and what we've done to our planet.
And that's certainly something in the, I think you were talking about a gathering up, like I think it was in our first week, we were talking about gathering up the past to the present, and I really see or feel grief as a gathering up of all of those experiences, because without them we couldn't feel the grief that we're feeling right now for the earth and the loss of biodiversity and, you know, the loss of lives through the coronavirus pandemic. But all of those things we need to gather up authentically, fully, wholly, and in that space.
Yes, absolutely.
Sit with and see what might arise.
Yeah, there's definitely a gathering in of all the different ways of seeing or knowing, and all through your own emotions, your own phases, stages of life. Everything, I think, should be gathered in, and that it really is the only way that it can be transformed in some sense, if it's going to transform. To sort of make them, they've made you who you are today, your experiences. So to cut them off, in a sense, is a sort of severing of that part of who you were. And that never felt quite right to me either, especially if in the past, if you sort of are trying to let go perhaps of something which caused you a lot of upset, especially if it's losing someone that you've loved, and that's through death especially, that's very difficult. You have, I think it's much more powerful to gather that in and hold it, and just go through it. And if it means you are upset for many years, or you're in that sort of grief for many years, it will keep moving through it. I think it's when you resist it, you get stuck. But if you embody it fully, it will always shift and change and move through. But it will also change you, because we are part of our experiences. Who we are is part of what we've experienced in life. And not entirely, but part of it.
Definitely. So I think I just returning to how I feel quite slow and humbled by what's happening, humbled by, you know, the complexity and depth of the grief that I'm particularly feeling, and that has come really quite strongly into my life, you know, through the kind of process that we've been talking about, I suppose, over the last few weeks. And, you know, while that's quite uncomfortable, I also see that, you know, in there is an opening, like you, I think you said transformation. There's a possibility for transformation. There's a possibility for doing something differently. And
Absolutely.
you know, I think that kind of leads us very nicely into the kind of theme for the 4th week, which is what we had when we were first discussing this, which is sort of acting and rebirth. How do we, the world is talking to us, you know, to go back to the title of all of these dialogues, and how we live is our reply. And so
Yes.
how we live now, how we act now from this point, having had the reset button pressed on us through this lockdown and coronavirus, how do we move into the world, rebirth, transformation, and reply now to the world that has been talking to us so strongly?
Yes, and that's what we'll talk about next time.
Yeah.
And explore that a little bit, won't we?
Yeah, definitely.
Through that sort of phoenix really rising from the ashes. And but I think it can happen in a big swoop of an action, if you like. And we also have our own little sort of deaths and rebirths all in a day, many times over, of certain things, don't we? You have an idea, or you think of something, well, that maybe I won't do that, and that sort of dies a death, and then something else might come up, or you know. And I think Jung said rebirth is one of the most profound affirmations amongst all mankind, and a very strong archetypal emotion, which has always been there. So it's a natural progression, I think, that's happened now. So yeah, we'll be discussing a little bit about just exploring that, really, of what might happen when you know, how might you act differently in the world, or how might you be thinking or approaching the world differently, or attending to it differently, with that having been through what you've been through.
Yeah, lovely. That was lovely. Thank you, Mary. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Pleasure. Really, really lovely. Thanks, Louise. Well, I'll speak to you very soon.
Yeah, definitely. Take care.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.